This is my ranking of ARPGs that I've played, based purely on my personal experience. Each one is placed from masterpiece down to trash, depending on how fluid and responsive the combat feels, how meaningful the loot and character progression systems are, and how well each game balances fast action with deep build customization and replay value. Let's get straight into the list. Last Epoch mixes fast combat with a huge amount of build customization, and that balance kept me experimenting for hours. I liked how every class slowly opened into completely different playstyles once the skill trees became larger. Changing abilities, adjusting passives, and rebuilding gear never felt confusing, which made trying new setups much easier than in many other ARPGs. The campaign story lost momentum later on, but the combat loop and endgame systems carried the experience without much trouble. Monolith runs stayed rewarding because I was constantly chasing better loot and stronger combinations for my character. Boss fights also demanded more attention once difficulty increased, especially during larger encounters filled with effects and enemy attacks from every direction, and I never felt tired of experimenting. This easily earns a spot in my excellent tier. Sworn reminded me of Hades, and that comparison stayed in my head during nearly the entire experience. The combat felt solid with weighty attacks, satisfying dodge timing, and boss fights that demanded attention instead of mindlessly rushing through rooms. I also liked the comic-style visuals because every area had its own atmosphere, especially the darker swamp locations and ruined castles filled with enemies inspired by Arthurian legends. The biggest issue was how little of it felt original once I spent more time with the systems. Boons, progression, and several mechanics copied ideas so closely that separating the game from its inspiration became difficult. Co-op made runs more entertaining, and the weapon variety helped experimentation stay fun during repeated runs across different areas and encounters. This remains in my mediocre tier. Dragonkin the Banished delivered the kind of ARPG power fantasy where huge enemy groups disappeared within seconds once my build started coming together. I picked the Archer class and spent most fights covering the screen with volleys of arrows while constantly changing skills through the ancestral grid system. That mechanic was easily the most interesting part because finding upgraded versions of abilities kept builds changing throughout the campaign. The story had some strong moments, especially during dragon encounters and larger boss fights, but too much dialogue and lore slowed parts of the adventure down. I also thought the environments looked great, even when the mission structure became repetitive after many hours. Exploring large maps, upgrading the city hub, and improving gear kept progression satisfying enough to stay invested. This finds its place in my good tier. Secrets of Grindea has far more content and personality than I expected from its old-school RPG style. The combat looked simple at first, but later boss fights demanded better timing, smarter builds, and far more patience than I expected. I spent a lot of time changing skills, grinding for stronger gear, and collecting cards that slowly made difficult encounters more manageable. What kept me interested was how varied everything felt during the adventure. One moment I was solving puzzles or exploring side activities, and the next I was fighting bosses that completely changed how I approached combat. The pixel art and animations also looked fantastic throughout the entire journey, giving every area and character more charm. Some difficulty spikes became frustrating at times, especially during longer boss sequences, but this still earns a place in my great tier. Diablo IV locked me into its combat loop because almost every fight felt satisfying once my build started becoming stronger. I spent most of my time experimenting with different gear perks, adjusting skills, and chasing loot upgrades that completely changed how certain abilities worked. The darker atmosphere and world design also stood out a lot compared to earlier entries in the series. Exploring dungeons, fighting through massive enemy groups, and taking down larger bosses rarely became repetitive because progression always felt meaningful. I also liked how every class had distinct mechanics that made trying new characters feel worthwhile instead of repeating the same experience again. The campaign story slowed down during certain sections, but the combat, endgame activities, and build variety carried the experience for dozens of hours without much trouble. This easily belongs in my excellent tier. No Rest for the Wicked felt very different from most ARPGs because the combat moved at a slower and more deliberate pace. Every dodge, parry, and attack timing mattered, especially during tougher fights where rushing in usually ended badly for me. I liked how each weapon handled differently since it made experimenting with builds and combat styles more rewarding throughout the journey. The world design also stood out with its darker fantasy atmosphere, detailed environments, and incredible lighting that made nearly every area look memorable. Exploring the city hub, rebuilding parts of it, and interacting with different characters added variety between combat sections. There were still some frustrating moments caused by inventory management and occasional technical issues, but the presentation and combat quality carried the experience throughout. This deserves a spot in my excellent tier. Ravenswatch mixes fast, roguelike combat with fairy tale-inspired characters, and that combination made every run feel different from the last. I liked how each hero completely changed the gameplay style, especially characters like the Pied Piper and Scarlet, who played nothing alike during combat. The timer system also added pressure, because every day and night cycle pushed me to move quickly instead of slowly clearing the map. Combat stayed smooth the entire time, with flashy abilities, fast movement, and chaotic fights that became even more entertaining during multiplayer sessions. The art style deserves credit too because it balanced darker fantasy themes with colorful visuals without losing atmosphere. Solo runs felt much harder and less balanced once larger enemy groups appeared, but the variety of heroes and upgrades kept every session interesting enough to continue experimenting. This belongs in my great tier. Slormancer leans completely into chaotic fun instead of trying to tell some deep emotional story, and that worked extremely well. I picked the mage class and spent most battles filling the screen with ridiculous attacks while experimenting with different upgrades and abilities. Combat stayed fast, colorful, and satisfying even during larger fights packed with enemies and projectiles. I also liked how the game handled humor because most jokes felt natural instead of forcing parody into every conversation. The pixel art animations added even more personality, especially during combat where movement looked exaggerated in a good way. The menus became overwhelming because of the massive amount of text and skill explanations, but the loot system and build variety still made experimentation rewarding during longer dungeon grinding sessions. This easily lands in my great tier. Alaloth Champions of the Four Kingdoms starts with very little guidance, and that made the opening hours feel confusing at first. Once I stopped expecting a story-heavy RPG experience and focused more on exploration and dungeon clearing, the game became much more enjoyable. I liked traveling across the world map, discovering new locations, and slowly building my character through tougher encounters and boss fights. The combat had some interesting ideas with stamina management, dodging, and heavier attacks, although the isometric camera sometimes made larger fights difficult to read clearly. I also thought the world itself had strong atmosphere because different regions, enemies, and kingdoms made exploration feel rewarding during longer sessions. Quest design became repetitive after many hours, and the writing overloaded me with lore constantly, but the dungeon crawling still carried the adventure. This settles into my good tier. Path of Exile 2 took over my time once the combat systems and build crafting started opening up. Every class felt dramatically different, and I spent hours experimenting with skills, support gems, and massive passive trees to create stronger combinations. Combat also felt far more active than many other ARPGs because dodging, positioning, and learning boss patterns mattered constantly instead of simply spamming abilities. I especially liked how the endgame introduced new systems, challenges, and progression paths long after the campaign was over. Even the procedurally generated areas stayed interesting because enemy encounters and rewards kept changing throughout every run. Loot balancing still needed work during early access, and replaying campaign sections twice became repetitive after a while, but the customization depth and satisfying combat loop outweighed those frustrations. This stands at the very top in my masterpiece tier. Titan Quest II felt much smoother and more satisfying than many older ARPGs inspired by classic formulas. I played with a rogue and earth-focused build, and watching enemies get crushed by larger elemental attacks stayed entertaining for hours. The skill system already offered plenty of flexibility during early access, especially once modifiers and passives started changing how abilities behaved during fights. I also liked how good the world looked, because the Greek mythology setting gave environments, monsters, and bosses much more personality than standard fantasy locations. Exploration constantly rewarded me with hidden events, enemies, and gear scattered across different areas. The biggest problem was inventory management because loot dropped in absurd amounts and forced non-stop vendor trips. The story also failed to leave much impact, but the combat quality easily carries this into my excellent tier. Shape of Dreams had some interesting ideas with its MOBA-inspired combat and huge amount of build customization, but the experience lost my interest pretty quickly. I liked the freedom of mixing abilities together and creating strange combinations during runs, especially since the game allowed multiple copies of the same skill at once. The problem was that many runs started feeling repetitive because most levels looked too similar, and enemy encounters lacked enough variety to stay exciting for long. Combat also became visually overwhelming once the screen filled with non-stop effects and abilities during larger fights. I thought the character designs were decent, and experimenting with different archetypes had potential, but the progression loop never felt rewarding enough to keep me invested. After several runs, everything blended together without many memorable moments. This easily falls into my trash tier. Heroes of Hammerwatch II made every run feel rewarding because almost every session unlocked something useful, even after repeated deaths. Building up the town, unlocking stronger upgrades, and improving different classes made progression feel worthwhile the entire time. I also liked how flexible the builds became once new skills, subclasses, and gear combinations started opening up during longer runs. Combat stayed fast and satisfying, especially when larger enemy groups filled the screen and forced me to constantly avoid dangerous attacks. The pixel art style and music also gave the adventure a charming atmosphere that matched the gameplay perfectly. Multiplayer made the experience better because running dungeons with friends created entertaining fights compared to playing alone. Some grinding was definitely required for stronger progression, but the gameplay loop stayed addictive throughout. This easily earns its place in my great tier. Death Must Die takes bullet heaven combat and adds strong build variety that stayed entertaining during nearly every run. I spent most sessions experimenting with different god blessings, gear setups, and character builds, while trying to survive larger enemy swarms filling the screen. Combat felt fast without becoming completely mindless, because positioning and ability choices still mattered once tougher enemies started appearing. I also liked how the pixel art style balanced darker themes with colorful effects during battles, making every run visually satisfying to watch. The customization helped a lot since different weapons, passives, and blessings constantly changed how each attempt played out. It was still clearly an early access game in certain areas, especially with content limitations after longer sessions, but the gameplay loop stayed addictive enough to keep returning. This belongs in my excellent tier. V-Rising made survival crafting far more enjoyable for me because it constantly pushed me toward meaningful boss fights and new vampire abilities. I never felt lost wondering what to do next, since the bounty system always pointed me towards stronger enemies, better gear, and fresh powers to unlock. Combat also stayed engaging because every boss demanded proper movement, careful ability timing, and smarter positioning instead of mindlessly attacking. I liked how customizable the experience became too, especially with options that reduced grinding and let me focus more on combat and castle building. Creating a giant vampire fortress while exploring dangerous regions made progression satisfying throughout the adventure. Some visual areas looked plain compared to other modern ARPGs, but the combat loop and progression systems easily carried the experience for dozens of hours. This belongs in my excellent tier. Hades 2 took everything I liked about the first game and expanded it with more variety, stronger character writing, and better combat flow. Playing as Melino felt completely different because her abilities focused more on positioning, magic control, and carefully managing enemies during larger fights. I also loved how every run introduced something new, whether it was another character interaction, stronger upgrades, fresh areas, or different build combinations through the Gods and Boons system. The two separate routes added much more replay variety since bosses and locations constantly changed between runs. Combat stayed fast and satisfying the entire time, especially once stronger weapon variations and abilities started unlocking later on. The music, art direction, and voice acting were also incredible and gave nearly every moment more personality. This stands proudly in my masterpiece tier. Ember Knights stayed fun because every run rewarded me with new upgrades, stronger relics, and different skill combinations to experiment with. Combat moved at a really fast pace, but I liked how ability cooldowns depended on landing attacks instead of waiting around for timers to finish. That small change made fights feel much more active during larger enemy encounters and boss battles. I also enjoyed trying different weapons because each one changed how I approached certain rooms and builds during runs. The progression system encouraged experimentation too, especially once more upgrades and relic combinations became available later in the game. The story barely existed and some dungeon layouts became repetitive after many hours, but the combat loop remained addictive enough that I always wanted another run afterward. This easily secures a place in my great tier. Svarog's Dream had some interesting ideas with its death and rebirth system, but too many parts of the experience felt rough and frustrating during longer sessions. I liked how every death forced me into a new character body because it created tension while exploring dangerous areas and trying to recover lost gear. The world itself also had strong atmosphere, with dark fantasy locations, strange encounters, and plenty of freedom to explore almost anywhere from the start. The biggest issue was how clunky many systems felt once I spent more time with the game. Combat animations looked awkward, inventory management became annoying, and movement pathfinding constantly caused problems while traveling across the map. Some quests and discoveries were genuinely memorable, but the experience lacked enough polish to stay consistently enjoyable for me. This ultimately stays in my mediocre tier. Diablo II Resurrected Infernal Edition reminded me why this series became so influential in the first place. Combat still felt dangerous because enemy resistances, positioning, and careful build planning mattered more than simply rushing through every fight. I spent countless hours chasing better loot, experimenting with builds, and farming bosses because the item system remained rewarding even after long sessions. The remastered visuals also looked fantastic, while still keeping the dark atmosphere and identity of the original game intact. I especially liked how progression continued feeling meaningful through higher difficulty modes, where enemies became genuinely threatening again. The new Warlock class added more build variety without damaging the balance that already worked well. Some mechanics definitely showed their age, especially inventory management and slower pacing early on, but the gameplay still feels timeless. This belongs in my masterpiece tier. Banquet for Fools has an unusual art style and old-school RPG design that refused to guide me through everything. I liked exploring the world without constant quest markers, since discoveries and conversations felt more rewarding than simply following objectives on a map. The atmosphere also felt unique thanks to the strange fantasy setting, detailed environments, and music that mixed medieval sounds with darker tones really well. Combat had some interesting ideas too, especially once I understood how the pause system and party mechanics worked during larger fights. The problem was that many systems felt overly complicated and frustrating during longer sessions. Party AI could become unreliable, traveling across larger areas became tedious, and the learning curve was harsher than necessary for newcomers. The world and gameplay systems were engaging enough for this to reach my good tier. That's my full ranking of ARPGs based on combat feel, build depth, and loot-driven progression. Some deliver deep, addictive systems with endless experimentation, while others fall off due to repetition or imbalance, but each one shows a different take on the action RPG loop. Thanks for watching.